In the beginning of this story, there is no beginning that can be clearly placed. Because war does not begin where swords are drawn, it begins much earlier, in silence, in interpretation, in the small, invisible shift where peace starts to feel temporary. And in the world that would one day be remembered as Troy, nothing yet understood that it was already inside a story that had been written elsewhere, not by mortals, but by forces that do not speak in actions, only in inevitability. And among these forces, there was a presence that did not choose conflict, but shaped it through absence of agreement. A single moment, a decision that should not have mattered. An apple, but not as an object, as a question. A question that did not belong to any one god, but still demanded an answer. And when questions are not answered, they begin to echo. And echoes always grow larger than their origin. And so Olympus, the realm above perception, shifted slightly. Not loudly, not visibly, but in a way that only tension can shift something that has no physical form. And from that tension, three interpretations of existence began to separate: Hera, Athena, Aphrodite. Not as personalities in conflict, but as perspectives that could not exist in agreement. One saw power as order. One saw power as intelligence. One saw power as desire. And none of them were wrong. And because none of them were wrong, there was no resolution, only escalation. But even escalation in its earliest form is still quiet, because it is not yet expressed. It is only becoming inevitable. And somewhere below that silent disagreement of gods, mortals continued their lives without knowing that reality itself had begun to lean in a certain direction. Troy existed not as a symbol yet, but as a place that believed in continuity. Walls were built not out of fear, but out of certainty that tomorrow would resemble today. And certainty is always the first illusion to break, because nothing in existence agrees to remain unchanged forever. And among those who lived within this growing city, lives continued as they always had. Love formed without awareness of consequence. Promises were made without knowledge of weight, and choices were made as if time would always forgive them. But time does not forgive. It only records. And Kronos, even now, did not interfere, because Kronos does not choose events. He only ensures that whatever is chosen remains irreversible. And so, slowly, the idea of Helen began to take shape within the structure of this unfolding myth. Not as a cause, but as convergence, a point where multiple threads of existence begin to pull toward a single direction. And convergence is not gentle. It does not ask permission. It simply begins to gather everything around it. Menelaus, Paris, kings, oaths, alliances, none of them were origins. They were responses. And responses always come after something deeper has already decided the direction. But even that decision was not conscious. It was mythic gravity, the sense that certain outcomes already exist somewhere ahead, and all actions are simply moving toward them. And as this gravity increased, the gods observed, not as participants yet, but as reflections of forces that mortals would later interpret as intention. Ares felt the tightening of conflict like a pulse that had no beginning. Athena observed the structure forming beneath the motion, calculating without interference. Aphrodite understood that desire is never isolated. It always spreads beyond the one who feels it. And Zeus, above all, understood something heavier, that once alignment begins,
Even gods become part of sequence rather than control. And so the judgment was made, not as an event, but as a shift in inevitability. And somewhere in that shift, Paris made his choice. But even that word, choice, is too strong, because in myths, choices are rarely free. They are intersections where unseen forces meet and call something decision. And the apple was given, and from that moment, nothing remained separate anymore. Because separation is only stable until it is observed by something that demands unity. And war, though it had not yet been declared, had already begun its quiet formation inside reality. Not as violence, but as alignment. Everything now leaning toward rupture.
And as alignment tightened across existence, something else began to emerge beneath the surface of the world. Not yet war, but preparation for sorrow. Because before any great collapse, the world always learns how to feel attachment. And attachment is what makes loss possible. Within the city of Troy, life still believed itself whole. But wholeness, like all fragile truths, does not announce its departure. It simply begins to thin. Moments still felt ordinary. Conversations still carried warmth. The sun still rose without hesitation. And yet, something in the air was no longer fully present, as if reality itself had begun to listen to something far away, something not yet spoken, something approaching. And far beyond mortal awareness, two presences began to take form not as individuals, but as opposing movements within fate itself: Achilles and Hector. Achilles was not created for war. He was what war becomes when it takes human shape and learns how to feel. Not anger alone, but absolute refusal of limitation. The idea that something within existence should not be allowed to end. And in that refusal, there is power, but also isolation. Because what does not accept limits cannot remain fully within the world that is defined by them. Hector, on the other hand, was not resistance to Achilles. He was something quieter: continuity. The attempt to preserve what already exists, even when existence itself begins to loosen. He did not fight because he desired destruction. He fought because something must remain recognizable after everything changes. And that responsibility weighs differently than rage. It is heavier, slower, more human. And between these two forces, even before they met, the shape of tragedy was already forming. Because true conflict is never between good and evil. It is between two necessary truths that cannot exist at the same time without breaking something larger. And somewhere within this slow unfolding, another presence began to matter more than the war itself. Patroclus. Not as a warrior at first, but as a closeness that gives meaning to distance. A presence that makes silence feel shared rather than empty. And in the structure of myth, such connections are never small. They become pressure points within fate, because when something is loved, its absence becomes mathematically inevitable in the logic of tragedy. Above them, the gods did not intervene directly. They observed in patterns. Ares felt the tightening pulse of inevitable confrontation growing sharper, like a rhythm that cannot stop once it begins. Athena saw structure forming within chaos, where every choice already contained its opposite. Aphrodite understood that desire does not remain local. It spreads through consequence, binding unrelated lives into shared outcomes. And Zeus remained still,
because even authority recognizes when events no longer require permission to proceed. And so time moved forward, but not as a clean line, as a gathering storm that had not yet revealed its center. Within Troy, nothing yet called itself war, but small fractures began to appear in perception. A word spoken slightly too sharply, a promise repeated too often to remain light, a silence between allies that lasted just long enough to be noticed. These were not events, they were symptoms, and Achilles began to feel it first not as knowledge, but as distance. A growing sense that the world around him was no longer stable in the way it once appeared, as if reality itself had begun to prepare him for a version of himself he had not yet become. And Hector, too, felt it differently, not as change within himself, but as weight added to everything he was already carrying. Responsibility does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly until it can no longer be mistaken for anything else. And Patroclus stood between these forces in a way that had not yet been named, a connection that did not belong to strategy nor to war, but to meaning. And meaning is always what becomes endangered first when conflict approaches. And still, the war had not begun, but it was no longer absent. It was simply waiting to be recognized. Because once alignment reaches a certain point, events do not start, they reveal themselves. And somewhere in that revealing, the first shadow of loss passed over the world. Not visible, not understood, but felt. Like a memory of something that has not yet happened, but already exists in the structure of fate. And in that feeling, sleep begins to deepen. Because even myths of war eventually learn how to soften.
And as the sense of inevitability deepened across the world, the distance between moments began to collapse, not in chaos, but in slow recognition, as if everything that was going to happen had already begun remembering itself. Within Troy, the atmosphere changed without anyone agreeing that it had changed. Days still passed. Voices still filled the air. Life still continued its ordinary motions. But beneath all of it, something had shifted in meaning. Actions now felt slightly heavier than their causes, and silence lasted slightly longer than it should have. And Achilles, though still distant from the final shape of events, began to feel a pressure within himself that had no clear source. Not anger yet, not grief yet, but anticipation of rupture, a feeling that something he did not yet understand was already incomplete. Patroclus, closer to that emotional center than anyone else, carried something quieter, a sensitivity to imbalance, the kind that does not announce itself as fear, but as care. And care, in myths, is never passive. It becomes involvement without permission. And slowly, without declaration, the boundary between participation and consequence began to dissolve. Because in stories like this, no one remains outside the structure for long. There came a moment that did not feel like an event at first, only a shift in absence. A space where something should have been, suddenly no longer was. Patroclus left, not as a dramatic departure, but as alignment with something larger than personal intention, as if the narrative itself had decided that motion was required. And in that absence, Achilles felt something fracture inside him that did not yet have language. Not rage immediately, not action, but interruption. A break in continuity so sharp
that time itself felt uneven around it. And only after that interruption did emotion arrive fully, not as one feeling, but as many overlapping at once. Grief that had no object, yet fully understood. Anger that had no direction, yet already existed in total form. And beneath both, recognition that something irreversible had entered existence. And from that recognition, Achilles changed. Not gradually, but in a way that myth describe as inevitable transformation. Because in myth, identity does not evolve slowly under pressure. It reorganizes around loss. And when he returned to the structure of conflict, it was no longer as the same presence. Something within him had crossed a threshold that cannot be reversed. Meanwhile, Hector continued forward in the only way he knew, not as escalation, but as maintenance of meaning. Because when collapse begins to approach, some beings do not change direction. They hold the line of what already exists, even when existence itself begins to withdraw support. And Troy, still unaware of the full shape of what had already been decided above and below perception, continued to believe in continuity. But continuity was now only a surface. Beneath it, sequence had already been sealed, and the gods, observing without urgency, understood what mortals could not yet fully see, that the story was no longer moving toward conflict. It was already inside it, only waiting for visibility. And when Achilles finally stepped forward into the structure of war, it was not beginning, it was confirmation. And Hector, meeting that confirmation, did not meet an enemy. He met necessity. Because in myths, opposites do not fight. They complete the shape of what was already unfolding. And somewhere within that unfolding, the world itself began to slow. Not physically, but perceptually, as if reality understood that everything important had already been set in motion. And from here, nothing new truly begins. Only consequences deepen. And in that deepening, sleep becomes heavier, not as escape, but as acceptance of what cannot be changed once it has been understood.
And as everything that had been set in motion finally reached its visible form, the world did not erupt. It unfolded, slowly, like a memory becoming impossible to ignore. Troy, once believed to be unshakable, began to feel unfamiliar to itself, not through sudden destruction, but through the quiet realization that stability had already been lost long before anyone noticed. Walls still stood, but meaning had begun to leave them, and within that thinning reality, Hector moved forward, not with chaos, but with clarity. Because some beings do not experience war as rage. They experience it as responsibility reaching its final form. And Achilles approached not as pursuit, but as consequence given motion. He was no longer simply a person. He had become the shape of everything that had been denied continuation. And when they met, it was not a moment of spectacle. It was recognition. Two forces that had been slowly forming since the beginning of imbalance, finally becoming visible in the same space. There was no need for the world to react loudly, because by the time they met, the world had already accepted what was going to happen. Even silence had become heavier. And Hector, standing in the final line of what Troy still was, understood something without needing words. That he was not standing against a single man, but against the direction of everything that had already chosen its path. And Achilles, in that same moment, felt not triumph, but narrowing. Because victory, when it arrives inside inevitability, does not expand the self. It reduces everything around it until nothing remains to resist. And so the final meeting passed not as chaos, but as completion of structure. A structure that had been forming since the first imbalance, long before names were given to anyone involved. And after that moment, nothing in Troy returned to what it had been. Not because everything was destroyed, but because meaning had completed its cycle. And once meaning completes itself, it does not stay in place. It dissolves. The city did not fall in a single instant. It softened, as if reality itself was letting go of something it no longer needed to hold in its current form. Walls became memory. Sound became distance. Presence became echo. And Achilles remained within what had been left behind, not as a winner, not as a victor, but as someone standing in the aftermath of a shape that no longer required participants. Because in myths, what remains after completion is never celebration. It is absence that still remembers what it used to contain. And Hector did not disappear as defeat. He became part of the structure he had tried to preserve. Because preservation and loss are not opposites. They are transformations of the same necessity. And somewhere far beyond mortal perception, the gods observed not with emotion, but with understanding that events had simply reached their final expression. Not justice, not punishment, only completion of form. And Troy, as a place, as a name, as a memory, began to fade into something softer than history. It became story, and story does not end. It only changes the way it is remembered. And in that remembering, everything that had once been intense began to loosen. Not erased, not forgotten, but no longer sharp enough to hurt. And Achilles became quiet, not because the world demanded it, but because there was nothing left that needed response. And that silence spread, not as emptiness, but as return. Return to something older than conflict, older than identity, older than names. And within that return, something familiar began to rise again. Not war, not loss, but sleep. Hypnos did not arrive, because he was never absent. He was simply what remains when everything else stops insisting on being noticed. And Morpheus no longer shaped dreams of conflict. There was nothing left to resolve, only transformation into softer forms. And so Troy became a dream that no longer needed to be understood, only experienced as fading resonance. A story that continues not in action, but in quiet echo. And Chronos, even time itself, no longer carried weight here. Because endings like this do not move forward. They dissolve backward into stillness. And Nyx remained as she always had, not watching, not judging, only existing as the space in which everything that has ever happened can finally stop resisting itself. And in that space, everything loosens. Thoughts, memories, names, conflict, meaning, all of it softens until nothing remains sharp enough to hold attention. And what remains is not emptiness, but rest. And now, there is nothing left to follow, nothing left to conclude. Only the slow understanding that everything has already become quiet. And in that quiet, you can let go as well.